This is the tale of the Fairies of Hackpen Hill. So, my friends, just a short story today. As many of you know, a few weeks ago I was walking the Ridgeway, Britain's ancient road. And along that Ridgeway is a certain hill called Hackpen Hill. It's got a clump of beech trees growing out of it. Very strange kind of place. So this is part of my Songlines of the Ridgeway folklore series. Now, a few years ago, I was walking the Ridgeway alone and I tried to camp. I did camp in this copse of trees on Hackpen Hill, and it was a very strange experience. I had very odd dreams that I can't now remember. So, to my surprise this year, I found some other people camping on Hackpen Hill. They didn't quite have some strange dreams. Maybe the fairies took pity on them, I don't know. But in this way, I felt very much part of a very old tradition. So 350 years ago, there was an antiquarian called John Aubery, one of the very first archaeologists, you might say, a Wiltshire man like me, and he was doing some of the very first historical excavations and study of Stonehenge and Aubrey, and he also collected fairy lore, including this story, which I will tell you now. In the village of Winterbourne Basset, there lived a certain shepherd. He had a name. His name was Ambrose Brown. Real person. Now, Ambrose was a shepherd, relied on the wool industry, very common way of life in this part of the world for many, many, many centuries. And he loved being a shepherd, mainly because he loved the downs. He loved the rolling green Wiltshire hills, and he loved to spend all his time up on that hillside tending his flock and, having his lunch, maybe having a little snooze, and then taking his flock back down to the villages at the foot of the Ridgeway. But one day, Ambrose was having a bit of a snooze on Hackpen Hill, one of the old mounds at the top of the Ridgeway where most people kept well clear of. But Ambrose, he found it peaceful up there. He wasn't bothered with the stories of fairies and whatnot. Now, it was a midsummer day, and it wasn't like today. It's raining today. It was a sunny, warm day, and he just lulled himself to sleep with the whispering of the wind in the trees. When he woke up, startled, much time had passed. The light had faded. The sun had gone down. It was the gloaming, dusk we call it, that hinge between day and night, or as some say, the time between dog and wolf. Just that strange half light. And he looked up, and his sheep were nowhere to be seen. Hurriedly he ran to the edge of that copse and looked out, but the side of the hill, the downs, was completely deserted. His sheep had gone missing. Panic began to rise in Ambrose's neck. If he had lost an entire flock of sheep, he would be out of work. He would never be able to find work again. He would be a poor man. He ran panicked to the other side of the hill, and there, sure enough, in the fading light, he could see his sheep in a line on the bottom of the hillside. He ran down the hill and began to call the sheep's names. He blew his little whistle. He called out for them, but they ignored him. They were moving across the hill as if in a trance, and he looked back up the hillside, and there, up on the top of the Ridgeway, was a deer, a white deer, a white hind, and a strange ghostly light seemed to be emanating from that deer. This is a very old motif in a lot of old folk tales. And those sheep were following that deer like he was the Pied Piper himself, following that deer. Where to, though? And Ambrose followed where the deer was heading, and it was right back into Hackpen Hill. The south side of it was just a mound of old crumpled stones and weeds and twisted trees that even Ambrose didn't like to approach. But here in this half light, he could see an opening in the side of the hill, and that deer was heading straight into that opening where Ambrose could see firelight spilling out onto the hill, casting strange long shadows. And that deer went straight in there, and his sheep followed them. Well, Ambrose was terrified, as I was that strange night on that very same hill when I had strange dreams, when I woke shivering in the dark and couldn't get back to sleep. But Ambrose had a job to do. He had to seize his sheep, but he grabbed onto their backs, but they just ignored him and carried on going. Well, he had nothing else to do. He just followed his flock right into that hill, which closed up behind him. Inside, he could see firelight deep, deep into the hill, and he could hear strange gigglings and whisperings as he brushed past roots, damp roots in this tunnel that was going deep underground. And sometimes something would catch his clothing or give him a bit of a tickle. Was that a root, or was that a hand? But when he turned round, nothing was there, and the darkness was pressing cold and strange about him. He started to hum as the sheep went bah! Deeper and deeper into the hill, where lights started to play around him, and the whispering got louder, and suddenly a little bit of a and maybe a little snatch of music or something whispering all around him. There were invisible entities all around him, and then that cavern opened out into this huge chamber, the likes of which Ambrose had never seen. It was like some ancient burial mound. There were carved pillars with dragons and vipers and dogs all interlacing with knotwork all around, and just the most strange things, and jewels were all over the walls. And as he went deeper into that chamber, it had a vaulted arch, just like one of those cathedrals, just like Salisbury Cathedral that he had seen as a boy, and was overawed by the vaulted ceiling of that great cathedral. But this was even grander. It went up and up. But Ambrose's eyes were playing tricks on him, because the ceiling seemed to shift and move, and the pillars seemed to grow and contort, almost as if the whole space was breathing, and there were figures and lights and people dancing. And then he came into another chamber and another one, as if he was just propelled. He didn't have to move his legs, he was just moved forward. His sheep were still there around him, a strange, odd sight, anchoring him to the outside world. But everything else was undergoing a sea change. It was a very strange place, and there were figures dancing, and he could see musical instruments being played. They were playing lutes and viols and tabors, but as he tried to fix on the instruments, they would shift and change, and sometimes he would see a figure playing with a beautiful expression on her face, but as he tried to fixate, she would change into an old woman, or maybe the roots of a tree, and suddenly he would find himself back in a damp cave, and then he would change again into a glittering palace, or into some great breathing canopy of stars. The next minute he looked around, and he was not underground at all, but there were trees. There were the trunks of trees surrounding him, and he realized he was in a great forest, and many eyes were watching him, and there were fires happening throughout the glade, and he could see music, and a fire would kindle there with people dancing around it, beckoning him to join, but he would go close, and that fire would disappear, and he would be led to the next one and to the next one. Suddenly he could see sunlight through the trees. There were sunlit meadows. Even though he knew he was underground, he could see the downs. It was the downs of Wiltshire, but they were different. There were forests where there were no forests, and he was led and giggling, and his smile was huge. He was having a great time. All strangeness, all worry, all anxiety had left. He was just giggling and dripping his way through this sunlit meadow with the sun high above him, and he was going down towards a town. Was it Devizes? He was joining a great procession of beautiful, wonderful people, and they were dancing and cheering him on and giving him things to drink, and the music was playing in his ears, strange music, and he began to sing along to it. And as he sang, the whole procession seemed to sort of pulsate and twist and move and vibe and jive. And then he was in devices, but it was different, and he was drinking, and everything was strange. And look, a fish jumped out of the Kramer, but it had the face of a human, and eyes were in the walls, and it was all very strange, and things began to contort, and then suddenly he was back underground again. But wasn't I just in devices? No, he was back underground in this cavern, and lights were moving all over, and then these beings, these fairy beings made of light, would appear all around him, and they were like self-transforming things, and they would say in a language he could somehow understand, "Look at this!" And the lights would shift and change around him, and the whole cavern would transform and move, and he was propelled through various rooms again. Now look at this, now look at this, now look at this. And each time the visions would get stranger and more magnificent until Ambrose passed out. And he woke in a cold, dripping dawn on Hackpen Hill. The leaves on the beech trees were twisting and moving strangely. The bark on the trees seemed to just slightly breathe and contort. He looked through the tree line, and there, on the pale hillside, were his flock, munching away on the grass. And Ambrose got up and quickly hurried out of that copse and went down with his flock to the village of Winterbourne Basset. He spoke of his experience to people. Some believed him, some didn't. He spoke to one old aristocrat who called himself John Aubery, who wrote all of this down in a little book. But most people wouldn't believe him when he told of these strange things. He carried on doing his shepherd work, but he got less and less work. He became withdrawn and strange. People would see him in the village sometimes just looking at his hands as if he was wondering if or not they were real. And sometimes he would try and explain to people that all of this world we see around us is a dream, an illusion. He's seen the real thing, but he can't get back there. And many times people would see him walking around Hackpen Hill, trying to see if there was an entrance back under the hill, because he wanted to see again all the marvels he had seen. But he never, ever found his way in again. So, my friends, that is the story of the Fairies of Hackpen Hill. That is, of course, from a little scrap from John Aubery in the 17th century. He didn't say very much, just something about a white hind with corne going into the hill, and something about a shepherd finding numerous rooms within rooms within rooms, and strange people playing viols and things like that, and lutes underground, and that he was never quite the same again. That's it. But obviously the folklore story develops, and there's many stories like this of shepherds sometimes going underground looking for their flock and finding sunlit meadows in a cave underground. Lots of stories like this. We could probably trace this all the way back to Indo-European myth. Think of the underworld realms of, say, the ancient Greeks, with Hades and the Elysian fields and Tartarus all being there underground. Or in the Celtic side of things, the fairies being the Sidhe, that have been the old gods that have been banished into the fairy mounds. There's another similar to this fairy story I've told on this channel that has a version in Wales, a version in Devon, and a version in Lancashire somewhere. I've told the Lancashire version on this channel. I'll put a link to it. But both of those stories, all of those stories probably spread from Wales, so probably something in Celtic mythology and folklore in the pre-Christian imagination that's fed into this much later craze for fairy stories in sort of, I guess, the medieval all the way through to the 18th century. Ye Merry England and all of that. The other possible source of some of these stories, as I may have hinted at in this video, is maybe altered states, experience of altered states, perhaps a dodgy batch of grain, or perhaps the wrong kind of mushroom, dimethyltryptamine or psilocybin, or something along those lines that takes you very much out of your head and body, and then all these little fellows are saying things to you. If you want to watch another video on that subject, I'll put a link to it here.